Good day. Today is Wednesday, 24th September 2025, and in some respects, the last 24 hours have been tumultuous, and much of the tumult has been concentrated in New York, where President Donald Trump of the United States has addressed the General Assembly, the UN General Assembly, and has had a meeting, apparently a 7-minute meeting, with President Zelensky of Ukraine. There have also been some important developments in a number of other places, and one of the things that I am going to discuss is a really quite remarkable update about the military situation provided by the military of defense, the Russian military of defense in Moscow. But let us turn first to Donald Trump, to President Trump, and his various meetings and statements in New York. His meeting with President Zelensky in New York, his comments on Truth Social, which I will read out in full, and the diplomacy that is taking place, if one can call it diplomacy, that is taking place, it has taken place in New York, and what it tells us about the direction of US policy. Now, Donald Trump came to New York, and I think this is an important thing to reiterate before we turn to other things, specifically Ukraine-related things. President Trump came to New York formally in order to address the session of the UN General Assembly. He was there. There were other leaders from around the world there. They all listened to him. There was, I should say, many of them appeared profoundly shocked by some of the things that he was saying. I noticed that much of his speech was listened to in, silence. And it was clear to me that President Trump came to the General Assembly and with the intention of addressing the General Assembly, and he came in what was basically a fighting mood. Now, he was slated to speak to the General Assembly for 15 minutes. He actually spoke for 53 minutes, just short of an hour. In other words, he was already apparently put out because an escalator that he was on in the UN building failed to work. And there were also problems with the auto cue. And he, of course, brought all of that up in his speech. I'm not going to spend too much time discussing the speech itself, but suffice to say, it seemed to me to be an outright attack, not so much on the United Nations system, which, in fact, at one point in his speech, he appeared to support, but rather on the entire values and set of ideas that underpin it. So he spoke strongly against migration. He spoke about European countries in particular, and he mentioned specifically Britain having failed massively in this regard. He seemed to be, again, speaking openly against globalization tendencies in economics. He was extremely negative, to put it mildly, about climate change, the green transition, all of those things. And, it was quite clear that he was not in any way minded to change his mind on tariff policy or on Middle East policy. He didn't seem to me to be in the mood, for example, to shift policies on Israel. The United States, by the way, appears to be moving towards a full-scale sanctions assault on the International Criminal Court in The Hague, which has, of course, recently published indictments against Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel and former Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. If some of the reports about the sanctions the United States are preparing against this institution are true, then in my opinion, this institution, the ICC, is to all intents and purposes doomed. And I noticed that alongside these moves in the United States, 3 West African countries have now pulled out of the Rome Statute and no longer recognize the ICC. Anyway, Donald Trump came to the General Assembly and he spoke about all of these things and more. And he spoke in what I thought was an extraordinarily confrontational way. And, well, he took no prisoners. And it ought to be said that other leaders who were attending the same session as him, appeared to push back against him on various issues. So President Lula of Brazil, who was also there, before Trump spoke, made a speech in which he appeared to criticize many aspects of Donald Trump's policies and also spoke critically of what he called arbitrary sanctions. Prime Minister Sanchez of Spain spoke in favor of immigration. The president of South Korea spoke about the importance of climate change and said that it is absolutely real and South Korea remains committed to taking steps to mitigate it. The president of Indonesia spoke about bullying, the problem of bullying in the international system, and said that countries around the world needed to come together to resist this bullying. And again, he didn't identify the United States, but it was not difficult to work out whom he was speaking about. So President Trump came to the General Assembly, he spoke in the way that he did, and it was quite clear to me, at least, that he had much of the world lined up against him. I got the sense that he didn't care. I got the clear sense that he reveled in his own isolation and in the sense of power that he believes that the United States has, and he made it perfectly obvious, at least to me, that he doesn't take the international system, the rules-based order, which he briefly alluded to, or any of that at all seriously. And the Europeans who must have been listening to this speech must have been, well, by now they're probably used to it, but they can't have been happy. And other countries around the world that I've mentioned, Brazil, Indonesia, and South Korea, they're not happy with this speech and with the approach taken by the president either. But all of that was overshadowed by comments that the president made over the course of his trip to New York about Ukraine and about the conflict there. So I am going to start with his Truth Social post, which has attracted a great deal of attention. And I believe he said this after his meeting with Zelensky, though I'm not absolutely sure, but it really doesn't matter. But anyway, this is what he said. After getting to know and fully understand the Ukraine-Russia military and economic situation, and after seeing the economic trouble it is causing Russia, I think Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, is in a position to fight and win, the word win is in capitals, all of Ukraine back in its original form. With time, patience, and the financial support of Europe, and in particular NATO, the original borders from where this war started is very much an option. Why not? Russia has been fighting aimlessly for 3.5 years, a war that should have taken a real military power. The words real military power, the first letters of each word are in capitals, less than a week to win. This is not distinguishing Russia. In fact, it is very much making them look like a paper tiger. When the peoples living in Moscow and all of the great cities, towns and districts all throughout Russia find out what is really going on with this war, the fact that it's almost impossible for them to get gasoline through the long lines that are being formed, and all of the other things that are taking place in their war economy, where most of their money is being spent on fighting Ukraine, which is great spirit and only getting better. Ukraine would be able to take back their country in its original form, and who knows, maybe even go further than that! Exclamation mark. Putin and Russia are in big, capitals, big, big economic trouble, and this is the time for Ukraine to act. In any event, I wish both countries well. We will continue to supply weapons to NATO for NATO to do what they want with them. Good luck to all! Exclamation mark. So what to make of this really quite extraordinary, indeed bizarre post, which contradicts what US officials have been saying for the past year, including, by the way, General Kellogg, who is Trump's envoy to Ukraine. Even General Kellogg admits that Ukraine is in no military position to recapture the territory that it has lost. But here we have the President of the United States appearing to endorse Vladimir Zelensky's war aims in their broadest, most maximalist, most original form. He says that the Russians are useless, that they're a paper tiger, that they've been fighting aimlessly for 3.5 years, their economy is on the brink of collapse, there are massive queues for gasoline right across Russia, and it should be easy, therefore, for Ukraine by itself to win the war. They don't even really need the help of the United States, or so it seems, because NATO and the EU are providing Ukraine with all the help it needs, and all the Ukrainians need to do is to keep up their fighting spirit, go on the attack, and victory is theirs. They don't need to stop at their 2014 borders. They can march all the way to Moscow if they choose. Well, I am piling on irony on top of this post, because that is exactly what it looks like to me. Several people have pointed out that this is ultimately a work of sarcasm. Larry Johnson at Sonar 2021 has said as much. Sonar 21 has said as much. Taragami, one of the most insightful of Ukrainian military commentators, has made the same point also. A writer on the Daily Telegraph says that Trump is washing his hands of the Ukraine war, and it is Rob Crilly, who is the Daily Telegraph's chief US correspondent. He says that in reality, what Trump is doing is he's telling everybody that the United States is indeed now walking away. These are Crilly's words. Look beyond the headlines, and the statement is a lesson in messaging. Rather than pledging fresh support to Ukraine or loading up action on Russia, Mr. Trump appears to be handing things over to Europe and NATO. There is no suggestion of extra support for Ukraine or that he will punish Moscow further. His only commitment is to keep selling weapons to allies. Hardly a game changer. After staking so much of his own reputation to bring Putin to Alaska for talks and putting himself at the heart of negotiations, Mr. Trump has learned a difficult lesson. Ending a war is hard. It sounds as if he may have had enough. Now note that the Daily Telegraph is one of Ukraine's most fervid supporters in the British media. And The Guardian has published an article that essentially says the same thing. It's by Dan Sabar, defense and security editor. Trump's change in tone is valuable to Ukraine, but more than words are needed. And then we find out very quickly that the words actually also in themselves mean absolutely nothing. He says that Trump has talked about hardening economic sanctions, but this is not going to help Ukraine win the war, and there doesn't seem to be any conviction in the fact that Trump will impose these sanctions. I ought to say briefly that in his speech to the General Assembly, Trump again appeared to threaten the Russians with further sanctions, but he made it absolutely clear that this would only happen if the Europeans also took steps themselves, like stopping all further imports of Russian oil and gas. And if we're talking about the big secondary sanctions against other countries, China and India, the United States is not prepared to do that unless the Europeans do the same. And anyway, Dan Sabar goes on to say that even so, this would not help Ukraine win the war. A more concerted supply of US weapons would certainly help Kiev, though Ukraine's most pressing need is to improve air defenses. But that is not what Trump is offering, posting instead that Ukraine would prevail with time, patience, and the financial support of Europe. What Trump is referring to here is a continuation of the revised weapons supply program of the summer, whereby via NATO, European nations pay for US weapons for Ukraine. There is little prospect of a dramatic turnaround on the battlefield. From this, Ukraine itself has long since acknowledged that it cannot win back lands conquered by Russia through military means. In February, Zelensky accepted that some or all of the territory occupied since 2014 would have to be returned to Ukraine by diplomatic means, while other experts have talked about pursuing a highly militarized defensive strategy. In military terms, Ukraine can probably only manage to push out the Russian invader in one of two scenarios. One is a radical change in Western intervention, perhaps the direct involvement of NATO air power, but the idea is so politically unlikely that it ought to be discounted. The second is a Russian collapse, stemming probably from regime change at the Kremlin, of which there is no sign. So Trump, whilst appearing to endorse Ukraine's maximalist objectives, the ones that Zelensky was insisting on until actually March of this year, the complete reconquest of all Ukraine's territory, is actually pulling the rug from underneath Ukraine. What he's basically doing is he's taking what the Ukrainians have been saying, what Kellogg has been saying, what various Western commentators who support Ukraine have been saying. They've been saying, look, it isn't true. Russia isn't really winning the war. Ukraine is winning the war. Why, General Kellogg himself has said it. Ukraine is winning the war. The Russians are only advancing slowly, step by step, at phenomenal cost. So Ukraine is really winning the war. Russia is losing the war. So what Trump is saying, well, if Ukraine is winning the war, if Russia is losing the war, as you say, then what do you need me for? What do you need the United States for? Why do you need us to engage in negotiations to try to find an end to the war? Why do you need us to supply more weapons to you? Certainly you don't need us to supply weapons to you directly. You can continue to receive weapons in dribs and drabs from us, but they will have to be paid for by the Europeans. The Europeans, NATO and the EU, can go on writing out the checks for you. We're not going to write any more checks. We can go on, the Europeans can go on doing that indefinitely, And of course, that's all you need, because you tell me that you're going to win. So just go ahead and win. The Russians are weak. The Russians are collapsing. Their economy is shot to pieces. There's all these gasoline queues that you are talking about. As far as I understand it, gasoline queues have now mostly disappeared from Russia. There are still some in Crimea, and there are shortages of gasoline in Crimea. But elsewhere in Russia, the gasoline queues that we were hearing about have basically gone, just to say. But anyway, that is what Trump is in fact saying. He's saying to the Ukrainians, you tell me you're winning. He's telling Kellogg, you tell me the Ukrainians are winning. He's telling Starmer and Macron and all of those people, you're telling me the Ukrainians are winning. Well, fine then. Why don't we just let them win? And you don't need me. You don't need the United States anymore. I am walking away. Or, as Mr. Crilly in the Daily Telegraph is saying, I am washing my hands, finally, of the whole business. And in various other off-the-cuff comments that Trump also made, these are not either in his speech or in this Truth Social message, he was saying to the Europeans, well, if you want to shoot down Russian fighter jets that cross into your airspace, then go ahead and do so. It's nothing to do with me. You can go ahead and do it. I'm not bothered. He also, by the way, as I said, over the course of this meeting with Zelensky, appeared to be happy to meet Zelensky, but bear in mind the meeting only seems to have lasted for 7 minutes. So my conclusion from all of this is the same as that of Larry Johnson, Taragami, Mr. Crilly, Dan Saber in The Guardian. Trump is now finally saying, enough's enough. I am walking away. Note that he's not giving directly to Ukraine any more weapons. The Europeans must pay for the weapons. He's not providing Ukraine with any more air defense interceptors. The Pentagon has stopped supplying air defense interceptors to Europe, and that decision apparently stands. He is not agreeing to provide Ukraine with any security guarantees. There was no mention of that in this Truth Social post. Zelensky came away from the meeting with Trump saying that Trump would provide security guarantees after the war has ended. But then if Trump says that Ukraine is going to win the war, why does Ukraine need security guarantees if it is going to win? He didn't announce any new sanctions against Russia. He made the same threats that he's made many times, and nobody by now seriously believes he is going to act on them. He provided no backstop for any European peacekeeping forces in Ukraine. What Starmer and Macron and Mark Rutte have been agitating and demanding, well, ever since the start of the year. He said, essentially, he's saying, why are you worrying me talking about peacekeepers? You tell me that Ukraine is winning the war. So if they're winning the war, we don't really need to talk about peacekeepers anymore, because all we need to do is to sit back, and you and the Ukrainians, you tell me you have it all in hand. All you need to do is to keep on fighting, and you will win. You will get all the way to Moscow by yourselves. You don't need my security guarantees. You don't need my money. You don't need my backstops. You don't need my weapons, certainly not for free. You don't even need the sanctions and the tariffs against China, because Russia's economy is already on the brink of breakdown. You're telling me this all of the time, so I can walk away and think and discuss and decide to do other things. Now, one can understand what Trump is doing here, and if you go back to his Truth Social post, I have no doubt at all that this is the intention and purpose behind it. But to be clear, there is a risk. Just as Trump bluffed when he said that if the Europeans were prepared to impose sweeping tariffs, 100% tariffs on India and China, the United States would do the same. He bluffed because he had to gamble. He was gambling that the Europeans would refuse to do that. That particular bluff worked. The Europeans are not prepared to impose 100% tariffs on India or China. In fact, Britain is currently trying to negotiate a free trade agreement with India. Just saying. So Trump here is to some extent gambling again. Or to be more precise, he's just buying himself a little more time. Because he is telling everybody, Kellogg, Zelensky, Rutte, Starmer, Macron, Ursula, Lindsey Graham, you don't need me to do anything more because Ukraine is winning. But what happens when it becomes clear that Ukraine is not winning? What happens when Pakrovsk falls? What happens when Kupiansk falls? Won't all of these people come back and say, well, actually, Mr. President, it's not quite as we were saying before. The Russians somehow have found more resources, more abilities to keep on fighting than we expected that they would. We are now indeed in a crisis. By your Truth Social message, by your comments to Zelensky in New York, you gave the Ukrainians the impression that you were fully behind them. Given that that was the impression you gave, you can't now walk away. You can't let them collapse, because that, unless you step in, is what is going to happen. So Trump has once again bought himself time, something that he has shown himself, by the way, to be very skilled at doing. He makes threats, he makes statements that appear to be very pro-Ukrainian. Back in May, it looked as if he was going to join the Europeans in presenting a massive ultimatum to Putin with threats of sanctions to follow from it. And the Russians stepped round that, and he stepped round that when the Russians offered talks in Istanbul. In July, he threatened the Russians with massive sanctions and threatened China and India with massive sanctions. And, well, he stepped round that by sending Witkoff to Moscow and arranging the summit meeting in Alaska, the Anchorage meeting. And now, again, he's getting himself out of the problems he got himself into a few weeks ago at around the time of the Alaska summit meeting, when he appeared to give the Europeans the impression that the United States was prepared to offer security guarantees both to Ukraine and to European peacekeeping forces sent to Ukraine, which obviously went far beyond what Trump himself was prepared to do. He's sidestepped that by publishing this Truth Social post, by meeting with Zelensky, by making all of these encouraging words and saying, in effect, you don't need these security guarantees. You don't need the backstop because, as you tell me yourselves, you are winning the war. You've informed me about all of this. If we go back, after getting to know and fully understand the Ukraine-Russia military and economic situation. And that, of course, is his way of saying, the Europeans, Kellogg, Zelensky, all of them have educated him in these matters. So he now finally understands it. He's able to turn around and say, well, why are we even discussing security guarantees? Why are we even discussing backstops and peacekeeping forces when it's quite clear that Ukraine by itself, with the help of NATO and the EU, is going to win the war? So he's, again, bought himself time. But, well, he can string the neocons in Washington, the Europeans, and the Ukrainians only so far. But sooner or later, I can't help but think that they're going to come and they're going to say, enough's enough. We've had enough of these games that you've been playing with us. It's time that you put your cards properly on the table. Are you going to let Ukraine go down in the way that Afghanistan went down, in the way South Vietnam went down? Or are you, on the contrary, going to make real your various claims to be sympathetic to Ukraine by taking stronger action against Russia? And the time that President Trump may have bought himself by all this may not be very long. It will depend ultimately on events on the battlefield over which he has no control, but over which, by the way, the Russians do. Now, another factor which makes me confident that this analysis is the correct one is other things that have been taking place in New York. So, at the UN Security Council yesterday, the European countries and Ukraine proposed a resolution basically criticizing the Russians, affirming Ukraine's territorial integrity, its independence, its sovereignty, calling again for a cessation, an immediate cessation of hostilities. It was a resolution which was couched in terms which the Russians were certain to oppose. The United States, again, broke ranks with its Western allies by voting against the resolution. So the Russians and their friends, China and all the rest, obviously they voted against it too, but they had the United States on side with them. And I understand that either later today or perhaps tomorrow, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who's just arrived in New York, is going to have a meeting with Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State. And Marco Rubio, as he has been increasingly doing over the last few weeks, has been speaking to the US media and has been telling them that further sanctions against Russia are perhaps not the best idea, because if the United States goes down the route of further sanctions, it will be burning its bridges once and for all with Moscow, and that will jeopardize all moves towards a negotiated resolution of the conflict. Now, Rubio is talking like that, even as his boss, Donald Trump, is cheering the Ukrainians on and telling them that they don't need to negotiate. All they need to do is go on fighting and they will win. And they won't just win, but they will get all their territory back and march on Moscow as well. So we can already see the discord. But I have to say that I believe in some respects that it is the meeting with Rubio and Lavrov, the vote in the Security Council, that basically tells us more about the real direction of US policy at the present time. It continues to be not towards rapprochement with Russia. President Putin's press spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, has basically admitted that that is now at a standstill, that there's been no real movement further in terms of improving US-Russia relations. Anyway, not a rapprochement, not détente between Russia and the United States, but at any rate, a preservation of the dialogue between these two countries, which is important, and a joint desire, I suspect, to avoid further escalation. Now, having said all of this, I'm going to now express my own strong disappointment about one major omission from President Trump's comments yesterday. As far as I can see, he showed no interest in and showed no desire to move forward with the proposal that President Putin has made to extend the START treaty for a further year. It looks as if all of that simply doesn't interest this president or indeed his administration. And, well, I'm not going to repeat what I said in my previous program. I consider this extremely worrying and very dangerous, but there it is. President Trump's interest, major focus continues to be on other things. The fact that the US economy perhaps is indeed slipping into recession, the economic difficulties, therefore, that exist in the United States, his ongoing conflicts with his various political opponents, which I don't propose to discuss in this program, and his own continued agenda, which he did, to a great extent, by the way, lay out in his speech to the United Nations, which remains firmly America first. Anyway, there we are. That's Donald Trump. That's the events that took place in New York yesterday. He appears to be supporting Ukraine, but in fact and in reality, you could say that he is giving the Russians what they want. He is giving them a clear route towards a military solution to the war. It's the Russians who are winning, as I'm sure Trump ultimately understands, not the Ukrainians. The diplomacy of the last few months since Trump was elected has, for the Russians, been a distraction from their otherwise single-minded focus on the war. The Russians, as I've already said, after the meetings in China 3 weeks ago, probably feel that the most difficult period in that respect has passed, that the diplomatic pressure is off them, that the Chinese and the Indians and the Brazilians are now fully on side. I discussed in my program yesterday the burgeoning economic links between Russia and China. And now the President of the United States has basically said, well, since the Ukrainians claim they're going to win. I'm not going to waste my time anymore. Let them go on fighting. Let them fight with each other. Let the outcome be decided on the battlefield. I'm not going to provide the security guarantees. I'm not going to insist on the ceasefire. I'm not going to provide the Europeans with the backstop they want. I'm not going to ramp up weapons sales or direct weapons supply, certainly not for free, to Ukraine. The Ukrainians and the Russians can fight it out between them, and that, I think, is the message at the moment which the Russians ultimately prefer to hear. The Russians have become extremely skilled in deciphering Trump. There was a telegram post by the former Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev, who's now vice chair of Russia's Security Council, in which it was striking how cool he was in response to what Trump said. And as for Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, about the paper tiger comment, he said that Russia is definitely not a tiger. After all, Russia is more often compared to a bear. There are no paper bears, and Russia is a real bear. So we can see that the Russians are neither fazed nor especially bothered nor impressed by what Trump has said. They're used to this kind of rhetoric from Trump. They understand that one has to look beyond the rhetoric at the actual actions, and they welcome the fact that essentially Trump is leaving it to the war itself to play out. Now, I have to say, I understand all of this at some level. It still seems to me that a major opportunity to end the war has indeed been lost or thrown away. I've said many times that the Russians were completely serious about Putin's proposals, the ones that he made on the 14th of June 2024, what I have called Istanbul Plus. It still seems to me, as Steve Witkoff apparently advised Trump, that the simplest, most straightforward, indeed only way to bring the war to an end and to stop all the death and tragedy in Ukraine was to take those proposals, Istanbul Plus, seriously and to negotiate around them and at least to accept them in principle. But Zelensky and the Ukrainians were not prepared to do that. In fact, they refused to do that at any time. The Europeans did everything they could to obstruct the entire course towards negotiations and to a settlement. And now we have the situation where we are in today, where it is being left to the battlefield, for the battlefield to decide the outcome. And of course, as those writers in the Daily Telegraph and the Guardian and Taragami, the Ukrainian, all acknowledge, in any contest on the battlefield, it is the Russians ultimately who are going to win. Now, the single individual who perhaps is most to blame for this is Zelensky. It is now clear to me that despite strong opposition from the ultra-nationalists within Ukraine, there is a growing understanding in Ukraine that Ukraine is going down and that it needs to come to some kind of resolution of the war. Only a few months ago, Kirill Budanov, Ukraine's intelligence chief, actually said as much. He said that the summer would be the tipping point. From that moment on, if there was no negotiated resolution, the situation would just go on getting worse and worse for Ukraine. And that is exactly what we are seeing. But Zelensky has consistently fought against that kind of reality. He has always insisted on his maximalist positions. He's always insisted on keeping the war going. And you could say in a sense that yesterday he got from Trump what he wanted. That is why he is so happy. Not because he really believes that Ukraine is going to recapture all of these territories, but because the pressure on him now to reach a negotiated resolution of the war has also been turned off. And, well, you get now a further sense of the frustration in Ukraine from an article in Politico. In Zelensky's party, frustrations keep growing. As the screws tighten, it's no longer just the Ukrainian leaders, partisan rivals who worry about a creeping monopolization of power. And the article takes us back to Zelensky's secret speech that he made last week. We're getting more dribbles of information all of the time. It's now being described, that speech, in which Zelensky admitted that the situation on the front lines is deteriorating and that critical decisions might be made. But most of that speech, it turns out, was basically a diatribe, that's Politico's description, against Zelensky's political opponents within Ukraine. As Politico puts it, Zelensky didn't disguise his indignation with his domestic critics. And we're told that according to a pair of attending lawmakers who spoke with Politico on condition of anonymity for fear of inviting presidential wrath, the Ukrainian leader vented his frustrations to his own Servant of the People party, bemoaning members of parliament, civil society activists and journalists for failing to promote an unwaveringly flattering image of Ukraine. The diatribe denouncing those who, in Zelensky's words, were positioning themselves against Ukraine only added to what the lawmakers described as an encounter marked by underlying tensions. And we are told that Zelensky was in a combative mood, that he refused to take any responsibility for the incident a few weeks ago when he tried to take the various anti-corruption agencies under his direct control, that the lawmakers, the MPs, had expected Zelensky to be more mollifying and gentle in tone, but they were shocked to see the opposite, and that the overall sense that all of these commentators came away with is that Zelensky is continuing to concentrate more and more power around himself and his very small team of trusted advisors. And as I discussed in a program I made a couple of days ago, the MPs worry about the degree to which Parliament has been completely sidelined. The Ukrainian Parliament has been completely sidelined. Well, the result of Trump's meeting with Zelensky in New York is that Zelensky's position against his domestic critics has now been strengthened he can now tell them that the President of the United States backs him. And, well, already we see the frustration and unease and demoralization in Kiev, which already exists, but that demoralization is going to now get worse because the leadership, the political class in Kiev must now realize that they're stuck with a leader who is leading them on a disastrous course, but whom they cannot shift. Now, anyway, Trump can perhaps be excused here. The Europeans have always, of course, backed Zelensky. They backed Zelensky at every turn. It's proved impossible to shift Zelensky from his position, and he's proved impossible to get Zelensky to change his approach. So it's a matter for regret, perhaps, that a diplomatic compromise is impossible. But we see that that is where we are, and Zelensky's position, having now been further strengthened, in the intransigence in Kiev is only going to heighten, and nobody should make the mistake of thinking that simply because, say, Mercouris or Kupiansk or somewhere else might now fall, that situation now is going to change. And that now brings me to the military situation and to that report which appeared and which was published by the Russian Defense Ministry. And it is indeed a remarkable report. Now, to repeat again, until very recently, the Russian Defense Ministry gave no updates, no very direct updates about the state of battles in Ukraine. It regularly provided a daily update about the situation in the war, but it was basically a statement, very, very terse statements about giving a general idea of where the fighting was located. It would report the capture of individual villages and towns, and it would also give the Russian Defense Ministry's assessment of the state of Ukrainian casualties. Over the last few weeks, this has changed. About a month ago, General Gerasimov, the chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces and the overall military commander, gave a detailed update of the state of the situation on the battlefronts. And I said at the time that this was most unusual, telling us where the Russians were, what the state of the fighting was in any particular location. That was extremely unusual indeed. Then, about a week ago, he did the same again when he talked about the situation in Siversk and to some extent in Kupiansk. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry has provided us with a detailed update of the military situation in Kupiansk. And this is what they say. Military units of the West Group of Forces successfully carry out tasks to liberate the city of Kupiansk. As of now, Russian troops have taken control of 5,667 out of 8,667 buildings. So the Russians, in other words, control 2/3 of Kupiansk. At the moment, Russian troops have blocked, in other words surrounded, a large group of the enemy from the northern and western sides, taking them in a half ring. Combat missions to block enemy troops from the south continue. Among them are nationalists from the Freikorps detachment, terrorists of the so-called Russian Volunteer Corps. This is a unit made up of Russian soldiers, with Russians, ethnic Russians, with and former Russian citizens with strong anti-Putin views who fight alongside the Russian army, and servicemen of the Special Forces of the Defense Intelligence of Ukraine. That's the organization that Budanov heads. In total, up to 700 people have been blocked. 250 of them have already been neutralized. What the word neutralized means in this context, I have no idea. Whether they're dead, captured, wounded, or whatever, I don't know. In addition, the Ukrainian army has lost over 1,800 troops, 36 tanks and other armoured vehicles, 2 multiple launch rocket systems, as well as 137 field artillery and mortar guns the last month alone in an attempt to retain Kupiansk. If those casualty figures are true, then they are catastrophic. Just to say, in offensive actions, Russian assault groups, reconnaissance units, artillery units, drones and electronic warfare groups acted in an integrated manner. The strikes were carried out in a single surveillance and attack system, and that is clearly a reference to the Rubicon group and the way that it is operating. I've discussed this group in earlier programs, this group that now operates the Russian drones in the area of the special military operation. Then the Defense Ministry continues underground landing force tactics operating through engineering communications also contribute to the success. That presumably is an allusion to the Russian military using underground pipes in order to infiltrate behind Ukrainian lines. Anyway, all of that is already very interesting. But then comes the most extraordinary parts of this report. Kupiansk is an administrative center of the same name region and a large settlement in Kharkov region. The city is an important logistics center where a number of automobile and railroads crisscross. Kupiansk-Uzlovaya and Kupiansk-Sortirovochi stations and the T2109 and R07 roads. Supply routes for the entire Ukrainian group on the eastern bank of the Oskol River pass through this city. In this regard, Kupiansk has become a key point for the Ukrainian command to keep control over the eastern part of Kharkov region. This is also related to the city's advantageous defensive position. Kupiansk is located on both banks of the Oskol River. The right part, that's to say the west bank, the part on the west bank is on high ground and provides natural defensive advantages, while the river and its floodplain create an additional barrier for troops on an offensive. Like many other large cities in Kharkov region, the Kiev regime has turned Kupiansk into a powerful fortified area. Ukrainian troops have established fire control over the approaches to the city, including key roads and crossings over the Oskol River. Every building, literally every building, represents a well-equipped and protected concrete pillbox. In fact, the city has been turned into a fortress using reinforced concrete structures and minefields. Gaining control of Kupiansk will facilitate further advancing of the offensive into the depth of Kharkov region, including the directions towards Izium and Chuguyev. Now, Izium is located to the south of Kupiansk. It is a major transport hub. Lots of roads and railway lines intersect there. It is sometimes called the gateway to Donbass. The Russians controlled it for a period in 2022, but the Ukrainians recaptured it in the autumn of 2022. This commentary by the Russian Defense Ministry tells us that that after the capture of Kupiansk, the Russians do intend to move south and seek to recapture Izium again. And if they do recapture Izium, then they are located immediately to the north of Slavyansk, and that will put them in a strong position to complete the encirclement of Ukrainian forces in Donbass. I will come to that shortly. And Chuguyev, the other place mentioned, is a large town immediately to the south of the great city of Kharkov. The Russians have never, at any point in this conflict, controlled Chuguyev. This update from the Russian Defense Ministry is basically telling us that it is an objective. And that suggests that Kharkov itself, the city of Kharkov, which lies immediately to the north of Chuguyev, is an objective as well. And that is reinforced by what the Russian Defense Ministry then goes on to say. Because as it says, in addition, after Kupiansk is seized, it will open a direct route to Volchansk from the south towards the advancing troops of Group of Forces North. In addition, taking control of Kupiansk will allow the Russian troops to advance towards the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration on a strategically important road leading to the northern border with the Donetsk People's Republic. The important road in question is the last big supply road left for the Ukrainian grouping in Donbass. The other supply roads and railway lines passed through Pokrovsk, and Pokrovsk, as I discussed in my program yesterday, in the south, is now in the process of being captured. And then the update continues. This will accelerate the establishment of control over Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, which are key defensive positions of the armed forces of Ukraine in Donbass. The Russian Defense Ministry has never before provided us with an update like this. Not only are they giving us a detailed account of the situation in Kupiansk, that the Russians already control 2/3 of Kupiansk, that a reinforced battalion of the Ukrainian forces, including special forces and elite troops in northwestern Kupiansk, is surrounded, effectively surrounded. But the Russian Defense Ministry explains the ultimate future intentions of the Russians. It's giving us for the first time ever over the course of the special military operation an insight into Russia's future plans. After Kupiansk, 3 objectives. First, recapture Izium. To the south, the gateway to Donbass, the city immediately to the north of Slavyansk. Secondly, capture Chuguyev, the city immediately south of Kharkov. Now bear in mind that the Russians already have positions to the north of Kharkov. Group of forces north cross the border into Kharkov region in the early summer of 2024. They stop their advance at a village called Lipsy, which is still being fought over. It's on a height just north of Kharkov. It looks as if the Russian intention, therefore, is to take Kharkov city itself into pincers, ultimately to capture Lipsy, north of Kharkov, but also to capture Chuguyev to the south of Kharkov as well. And thirdly, once Volchansk has also been taken, to link up with the Russian forces from Group of Forces North in Volchansk, which are also now pushing south, and create a large belt of entirely Russian-controlled territory in Kharkov region, in effect completely reversing the gains of Ukraine's autumn offensive of 2022. But in a way that would threaten not just Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, but the city of Kharkov itself. And the Russian Defense Ministry is also telling us that the capture of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, the two big towns still under Ukrainian control in Donbass, is an objective and is the key defensive position that the Ukrainians have left in Donbass. The Russians, of course, are working their way through Pokrovsk. They are now, there's reports this morning that they're closing in on Konstantinovka from the south. In fact, once Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka have fallen, and Kupiansk, Liman, and Siversk have also fallen, and I discussed all that in my program yesterday, and Izium has been captured as well, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk will be the only positions, the only major inhabited places in Donbass still under Ukrainian control, and all of the main road and rail links will have been cut, and any Ukrainian troops who are still in these two cities will be surrounded. So the Russians, for the first time ever that I know of in this war, have lifted a window, drawn the curtain on what their future plans are. Now that is extraordinary. If you have been following this war as closely as I have done, you will know that the Russians never do this. I often comment about how secretive the Russian General Staff is, how it keeps its secrets to itself, its plans to itself. Well, now, for the first time, it has disclosed its plans. Well, why is it doing this? Well, of course, there are possible explanations. Maybe this is an exercise in disinformation. Maybe it's intended to make the Ukrainians do things that they might not otherwise do. It might, for example, make the Ukrainians panic about the imminent fall of Kupiansk and rush reinforcements maybe from the Pokrovsk area, accelerating the collapse of Ukrainian resistance there. Maybe it's intended to do that, to get the Ukrainians to rush troops from Pokrovsk to Kupiansk, exposing Pokrovsk and leading to the failure of the Ukrainian defenses in Pokrovsk. That's one possibility. Or it might be that the reference to Chuguyev is intended to get the Ukrainians to reinforce their positions in Chuguyev and to devote energy and resources to trying to prepare the defense of this large town. Whereas in reality, the Russians have no actual plans to capture Chuguyev. Their true objectives lie in other places. So there may be an element of disinformation. Or it could be that the Russian General Staff has come to the conclusion, which would be undoubtedly the correct conclusion, that the Ukrainians have probably, almost certainly, in fact, figured all of this out anyway, and that there is no reason to hold it back, therefore, and why not, therefore, say it. Or it could be that the Russians, who might have intelligence about what the Ukrainians know about Russian battle plans, that the Russians might have got moles and spies inside the Ukrainian military leadership. This is very likely, by the way, and that they are already fully briefed about what the Ukrainians know, and they can disclose all of this because they know that the Ukrainians already know all of this as well. I actually have a different view. I think that the reason the Russians are becoming so much more forthright about their battle plans is because they no longer think it matters. They believe that the Ukrainian army is now so exhausted and so depleted that it is so short of reserves, that it is so overextended and overstretched, that the Russians can be perfectly open about what they intend to do, because the Ukrainians are no longer in a position where they can prevent it. And by explaining their intentions to the Russian public and to the Russian military, of course, what the Russian military leadership is doing is conveying confidence, and that, of course, strengthens morale amongst the soldiers and perhaps with the civilians in the rear as well. I cannot see this kind of update as anything other than reflecting growing confidence on the Russian side about the trajectory of the war. Notice, for example, that this update talks about the military units successfully carrying out tasks to liberate the city of Kupiansk. It in effect already tells us that the Russian Defense Ministry expects Kupiansk to be, as they would say, liberated, and for that to happen relatively soon. They already control 2/3 of it. They presumably, this suggests that they expect the remainder to fall under their control within the next couple of days or weeks at most. So that's my assessment of the situation on the Ukrainian front lines today, at least in the Kupiansk area. There has actually been more news. There's been quite a lot of news from the Zaporozhye front lines. The Russians claim to have captured more villages as they advance westwards from western Donbass, deeper into Zaporozhye and Dnipropetrovsk regions. Perhaps more interestingly, the Russians appear to be close now to capturing the small town of Stepnogorsk to the south of the city of Zaporozhye. I've been looking at a map, and I noticed that to the north of this village, or this town rather, and a village called Primorye, which is located on the banks of the Dnieper River, that to the north of these places there is a water body, what looks like a large lake. And I suspect that this is a natural obstacle that is going to prevent further Russian advance from the south towards Zaporozhye city. I suspect they will advance to the banks of this lake, the southern banks of this lake, and probably they will then consolidate and use their positions to launch drone strikes on Zaporozhye city, which they're also, by the way, now heavily bombing. And also perhaps they could turn westwards towards Orekhov, which the Russian forces from the east are also edging closer towards. But anyway, I'm not going to devote more time to this today. And there's been reports that in the Konstantinovka area, the Russians are advancing as well, and that they're now also clearing, finally, the Ukrainian foothold to the south of the Kliban Bik reservoir, where the Ukrainian troops, allegedly 3,000 of them, have been trapped for, well, perhaps 2 weeks now. And yesterday there was a lot of reports from the Siversk area that the Russians have captured more villages and positions to the south of Siversk. It looks increasingly as if not only is there going to be an attack on Siversk from the north, where apparently fighting is already taking place, but as is usual with the Russians, when they storm a place, they like to attack from multiple directions at the same time. And it looks like a storming operation of Siversk from the south and probably the east is going to take place as well. Anyway, there's more obviously to say about the battlefronts. But this report, this update from the Defense Ministry, the Russian Defense Ministry, is already extraordinary. And it gives us an insight into the state of the battle, and it gives us a sense of the confidence that the Russians have about the state of the battle. And as they are reading the developments in New York over the last 24 hours, they now feel, I have no doubt of this, that they have an open road forwards to continue to develop the battle in accordance with their plans, that Trump is washing his hands of the Ukraine conflict. They don't have to worry about security guarantees, European peacekeepers, backstops, further sanctions, any of those things, at least for several weeks or months. And that gives them the opportunity to focus fully on their victory. Well, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.